download of information there, and a few, I thought, quite interesting, tasty points to get your teeth into. Jasmine, you raised a few, not least question marks about whether or not the division of labour approach that's very much being pushed by the European states is actually the right thing to be focusing on at this point in the Paris agenda, and whether or not it's a slight distraction. Is it looking through the telescope the wrong way, as it were, and there are other bigger fish to fry? And the other is about this notion of a whole-of-union approach. I mean, I and Dirk Willem here produced a blog just at the end of last week, ahead of the GERC, suggesting that the European Union does need to take its role as one much more seriously, not least because it's one of the few institutions that has a range of policy instruments at its behest that it could bring together much more coherently in support of, obviously, global poverty reduction, but also global public goods production more generally. But it would be interesting to see if anybody's got a view on whether or not, as Nick suggests, this might be something of a slight distraction at a point where, certainly in terms of ODA levels, it looks like individual EU member states are not able to quite deliver on their promises. Anyway, a first round of thoughts, comments, reflections before we go on to Matthew and governance issues. Anything? Yes, over there. We've got a microphone. Because we're streaming, we need to have everyone talking to a microphone.
Thank you. Mine is rather not a comment, but rather a question. My name is Fanny Mbawa. I am, hi Jasmine. I'm from Oxfam, GB. My first point, I wanted, Jasmine, if you could maybe shed a bit more light on specifically Ireland. When we say that Ireland, they are one of the donors who are already cutting their aid. But also, according to the report, they are among the 10 European countries who are likely to meet their 2010 targets. I'm not sure how that reconciles, whether the current cuts by the Irish government will have anything to do with their being able to meet the 2010 target. My other comment was specifically on the current crisis. According to this report, the World Bank estimates that there will be a financing gap between 270 to 700 billion US dollars to the developing countries if it continues. Now, against that background, and also that we've heard from Jasmine earlier on to say that the EU governments, last week or earlier this week, were unable to meet their individual commitments on aid. My concern is then, since that most of these developing countries are unable to bail themselves out of the crisis, do we see a situation whereby donors, specifically the EU donors, agree to setting up maybe new money or something like that to ensure that they help these countries who will be unable to bail themselves out of the current crisis? I am asking that against the background that, maybe I'll take a bit longer, against the background that the developed countries, are committed to bail their own banks. 43%, I think they agreed to have 43% of their GDP for helping the financial sector. So, thanks.
Thank you very much. Gideon, if you could bring sorry, you've only got one roving mic. So.
Thanks. Gideon Rabinovitz from the UK Aid Network. I just had a comment firstly on this whole-of-union approach. It's potentially an opportunity to push policy coherence within the European Union, for example, much more strongly, and that's all an agenda I think we feel would produce some very significant development results. But actually, if you look at the countries that are pushing it, it's many of the countries that are falling behind in their aid most significantly, and there are very real concerns. This is about hiding that picture. And as well, if you think about the fact that if you're really taking a whole-of-union approach seriously, what your contribution as a whole country is to development, it's very puzzling that if you really are taking that seriously, why the GERC said very little, in fact, possibly nothing, about illicit flows from developing countries back into the developed world. So issues around tax havens, around other illicit flows that are coming from poor countries. So it really does suggest very strongly this is not an agenda that's being taken seriously. And if it went in the direction of really embedding the policy coherence agenda within Europe, that really would be something we could celebrate.
Okay.
So I'll leave it there.
Okay, fantastic. Any more questions, comments at that round? Okay. Jasmine, do you want to start off on the point about Ireland first?
Okay, thanks for that, Fanny. Yeah, on the Ireland one, actually, it's one of the ones that looks still on target to meet its commitments because it's been consistently providing more. Now, that's not a reason for cutting back, and it's a shame. It's a shame that it did, and there is definitely evidence that where it has cut back is going to have a direct impact on the countries that it supports, on the projects that it supports. So it's a real shame to see that. I think the lesson is in the trend. And as I can't remember if I did mention, but we've had Italy cutting back by over 50%, Ireland over 20%, Estonia by around 10, over 10, and Latvia has suspended its budget entirely. These are just 4, and we're only in May. So this is a trend which we're going to see more of. So it's good to raise that question. I mean, Ireland is one of the ones which is still on target to meet its commitments, but many of the others won't be at all. And I just wanted also to respond briefly to that point about the whole of the union thing, and also the financial crisis, because the link is there between the two. One thing about providing additional monies or finding alternative ways to support developing countries in this crisis, I mean, there's lots of stuff that has come up recently, such as this flex mechanism, which sounds really technical and boring, but is a way of sort of front-loading or getting aid very quickly out the door from the European Union. Now, this is something which is obviously a good thing, because at this time of crisis, developing countries need access to resources because they haven't got the reserves, they haven't got the mechanisms for coping with the crisis. But we have to bear in mind this is new money. Oh, sorry, it's not new money. That's not on record. It's not new money, and so essentially we are talking about borrowing from the future. And the last thing I'd like to say, just on Gideon's point about the whole of union, and also Alison, something you said about thinking about different instruments, and multiple instruments which the European Union has at its fingertips to leverage resources. Some of these institutions are not the ones which are best placed to deliver on development. There's been a lot of discussion recently about the use of the European Investment Bank as a delivery instrument for aid. Some of these ideas are worth considering, and they do need very cautious consideration, because such institutions as this may not have the right development objectives or the capacity and technical expertise to do so, to deliver correctly on development objectives. And looking back at funding other big organisations, other big banks, is also something that we think needs some cautious analysis, given their past experience, their past performance on delivering development. So all of this needs to be taken very slowly and on a case-by-case basis.
Great. Nick or Rachel, do you have any responses to those questions?
I think only to underscore the point about the whole of union approach. I mean, that it is so warmly embraced in a GERC meeting, which also chooses to reduce the targets to a footnote, doesn't send a very doesn't send a very reassuring message. And so, whilst in and of itself, of course, it would offer more significant advances in terms of coherence, I think the context in which it's being peddled is not one that gives much reassurance.
Do we think that's fair?
I think the points on illicit flows, I think the issue was sort of failure in the GERC to headline illicit flows actually a backward step on illicit flows, or is the question which part of the architecture is the right place to expect to see these decisions pushed forward? I mean, we had of course the G20 commitment on tackling illicit flows and on tax havens, and we will then have the G20 finance ministers, and we'll have the next G20 summit, and we particularly are seeing it's important that those commitments made at the London summit are held onto, and the targets to deliver on both the asset seizure commitments at the G20, but also the tax havens commitments are taken through there. I think the real point at which we need to really make sure that we're seeing continued commitment to what was agreed at the summit is at the next summit.
Okay.
Myself.
Good. what we haven't heard yet is any real challenge to the framework, which is Paris and the commitments towards 2010. And I suppose as we approach, we need to start asking some questions about whether really this is the right framework. And if not, what do we need to be thinking about? Matthew, this is a good time to bring you in.